So before we start, Professor, first of all, thank you for accepting my invitation for a second time. Um, our previous conversation was about education in the Trump era and Betsy DeVos policy, and now we are a year and a half further, and suddenly we have a war in Ukraine and Russia. And I'm here in the Netherlands, and of course, Ukraine is not too far away. So I have some questions about the Ukraine-Russian war and about language and war, because language is always an integral part when you talk about war. It's an important instrument. So I would like to talk about language and about the current crisis in Ukraine. And a book that really inspired me was Manufacturing Consent, in which you explain the propaganda model. Maybe we can refer to it later. But before we start, how long do we have, Professor Chomsky? Because
Well, let's aim for 45 minutes, and if it goes on a little longer,
all right,
maybe finish.
uh, I'd like to start with a personal question. I know your parents are from. Your father was from Ukraine, and your mother was from Belarusia. I was wondering if these cultures ever played an important part in your upbringing. Do you know any? Was it a part of your life, the Ukrainian culture and the Belarusian culture?
Well, my mother, her family left when she was an infant, so it really wasn't part of her background. She grew up in an immigrant family in New York, working class uh, family in New York. That's that part of the family. My father and his immediate family managed to escape in 1913, importantly, 1 year before the war. Otherwise, he would have been drafted into the Tsar's army, and the whole family would have been exterminated. In fact, the entire extended family was exterminated by the Nazis and the Ukrainians who were collaborating with the Nazis. But he and they came from a small village, Jewish shtetl, it was called, a poor village in western Ukraine. Uh, it's, as I say, the extended family was all wiped out, but they escaped just in time. But my father almost never wanted to talk about it. He was 17 at the time, so he had grown up there, but really didn't want to talk about it. I mean, occasionally he would say things about what it was like when the Cossacks came through the town, terrifying everyone. And he, of course, talked about the extreme anti-Semitism, which is part of what they fled from. But beyond that, I mean, he was all totally immersed in Jewish culture, the revival of Hebrew. That's part of my own background, but not the Ukrainian background. The closest we came to it was reading the great Yiddish literature, Shalom Aleichem, Mendele Mocher Sfarim, the great novelist who depicted the life in the Eastern European shtetl. They had all translated their own work into Hebrew, and we read the Hebrew.
So it was not really, he Americanized, I suppose, after he immigrated to the United States, and you grew up without Ukrainian and Belarusian influences. So you don't have any recollection. So I was just wondering if it made you look at this crisis differently because of your roots.
I I can't trace anything specific.
No. Well, let's move on to the crisis itself. Where are we now? I was wondering today. I read on the White House website that Joe Biden added another $800 million to the Ukrainian aid, or adding it up to 2 billion since his administration started. I was wondering, what kind of narrative do you tell the Americans in order to support this kind of spendings?
What Biden's policies on
Yeah,
Ukraine
yeah, how do you sell? What do you tell your
have
own
solved
people?
it? Well, there is fortunately one statesman in the United States and Europe who has laid out, a person of a high political figure who has made a very sensible statement about how you can solve the crisis, namely by facilitating negotiations instead of undermining them, and moving towards establishing some kind of accommodation in Europe, maybe along in which there are no military alliances, but just mutual accommodation. He didn't say it, but it's something like what George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, not the second, proposed in the early 90s in his, when after the collapse of the Soviet Union, proposed what they called a partnership for peace, which would be open for Europeans generally, Eurasians as well. It wouldn't eliminate NATO, but he would live up to the promise that NATO would not expand to the east, firm promise to Gorbachev, keep to that, allow NATO there, but kind of de-emphasize it so other countries could join, including Russia for that matter, join the Partnership for Peace. Tajikistan joined, for example, not NATO, and move towards a world, a Europe, Eurasia with no military alliances. Actually, de Gaulle had similar vision. Emmanuel Macron, in his initiatives trying to contact Putin, suggested something similar. So going back to the one Western statesman, he didn't mention all of this, but he suggested something similar. Move towards negotiations and diplomacy instead of escalating the war. Try to see if you can bring about an accommodation, which would be roughly along these lines. His name is Donald J. Trump, the one statesman I know of in the West. Not my favorite person, incidentally. I think he's the most dangerous person maybe in history. But let's tell the truth. He's the one person who said it, and it's the right way out. Others have said it too, but not in high positions.
Well, what I'm trying to ask is, if you spend so much money on Ukraine, and there are so many internal problems in the United States. We have education, transportation, healthcare, and you spend so much money abroad. How what kind of story do you tell your citizens so that they support you?
That's where manufacturing consent comes in. You have to whip people into hysteria so that they want to, the only thing in mind is to destroy the enemy who is the ultimate evil. If you can get people whipped into that kind of hysteria, you can pour money into armaments and forget the domestic policies. It's an old story. Let's go back to World War I. Okay, World War I, every country, the intellectuals led the country into hysterical denunciation of the enemy and talk about their glory of their own country. In Germany, the famous manifesto of 94 leading intellectuals who addressed the West and said, we're the country of Kant, Goethe, Beethoven, center of civilization. We are now defending civilization against wild monsters in the West. In England, the same thing. France, the same thing. There were a couple of people who objected in Germany, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, in England, Bertrand Russell, in the United States, Eugene Debs, all ended up in jail. Okay, but the overwhelming mass of the intellectual community was mobilized in patriotic enthusiasm and hatred of the enemy. In the United States is an interesting case. The British, of course, wanted the United States to come into the war, so they established what they called a Ministry of Information.
Yes.
Which of course meant Ministry of Disinformation, which concocted tales about German barbarity, the Huns doing this, tearing Belgian babies to shreds and so on. And they fed this to American intellectuals who lapped it up. Intellectuals of the liberal intellectuals of the John Dewey circle. Woodrow Wilson himself was elected in 1916 on the platform, peace without victory. Within about a year, he and American intellectuals, mostly liberal, had whipped the country into such hysteria, anti-German hysteria, that the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven, for example. And everyone went to war with enormous enthusiasm to kill the hated Germans. Well, it was an outcome to the war. Germany was defeated. What did the great statesmen do? They decided to crush Germany. It's defeated, let's crush it. That gave us someone named Adolf Hitler. There were people who objected, like John Maynard Keynes, great economist, ignored. That's not always the case. Let's go back a century before then, the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon, the French armies had virtually conquered Europe. They were finally defeated in 1815. There was a conference, international conference, set up the Concert of Europe. And the people who ran the conference were not nice people. I would not want to have Metternich as a friend, but they were statesmen. So they brought defeated France into the Concert of Europe, an accommodation with defeated France. That led to a century of peace in Europe, not entirely, but virtual peace. Very unusual period in Europe's savage, monstrous history. But there was a century of virtual peace by integrating the defeated aggressor into the settlement. After the First World War, no, let's crush them and bring on Hitler. Well, there's some lessons we can learn from that if we want to.
So what you just said at the beginning is there's a big role for intellectuals when it comes to manipulating a public view. Is that the case right now? Is there an intellectual body that is pro-war at this moment?
35% of Americans, according to the most recent polls, will think the United States should directly enter the war, even if it might lead to a nuclear war. A nuclear war means destruction of everything. Destruction of the United States, destruction of Europe, destruction of Russia. We're finished. But 35% of Americans think we should do that. The reason is they hear it from figures in Congress and the media, of many people in the halls of Congress making heroic speeches, Winston Churchill impersonations about how we should set up a no-fly zone. Fortunately, there's one peacekeeping element in the American government. It's known as the Pentagon. The Pentagon is blocking it because they don't want to destroy the world. They understand, even if congressmen don't, that if you set up a no-fly zone, one of the first things you have to do is destroy Russian anti-aircraft facilities, which are in Russia. So you have to bomb Russia. What happens then? Does it take a genius to figure it out? So fortunately, the Pentagon is the peacekeeping element in the government, but not the halls of Congress. Plenty of intellectuals back this. In fact, it's quite interesting to look at the way this is playing out in the intellectual world, speaking of language. Take the phrase unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's de rigueur. Anybody who wants to talk about it has to call it the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Just out of curiosity, I did a Google search for the phrase unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. 2.5 million cases in 30 seconds. Then I did another search, unprovoked invasion of Iraq, 11,000, all of them from anti-war people. That's kind of interesting in itself, but it's even more interesting because it totally inverts the facts. The invasion of Iraq was totally unprovoked. In fact, Cheney and Rumsfeld had to resort to torture to try to elicit some shred of evidence that Saddam was cooperating with Al-Qaeda. Of course, there wasn't any. We don't have to talk about the disappearing weapons of mass destruction. There was no reason to believe they existed. So the invasion of Iraq was totally unprovoked. In contrast, the invasion of Ukraine was demonstrably provoked. Read the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, pointed out that since 2014, NATO, meaning the United States, has been sending advanced weapons to Ukraine, carrying out military operations with Ukraine. Last September 1st, you can find it on the White House webpage. Joe Biden's administration produced a policy statement calling for enhanced integration of Ukraine into NATO, increased joint military exercises with the U.S., new military, higher, more weapons sent, and so on. Extended this in March. The Department of State has officially stated that prior to the invasion, the United States refused to consider any Russian security concerns. Approximately the words. So yes, it was definitely a provoked invasion. Doesn't legitimize it. It's pure aggression, criminal aggression, but the facts are exactly 100% the opposite of 100% intellectual behavior. Okay? Well, that tells you how, it's a good one of many indications of how the intellectual world, including mostly liberals, line up in support of state power, just as they did in World War I in all countries, just as they've done in many other cases. When it becomes time to hate China, we'll all hate China. If it becomes time to hate the Netherlands, we'll all hate the Netherlands.
You said an unprovoked invasion, and Russia talks about a special military invasion. So it reminds me of the last chapter of 1984, in which George Orwell talks about a newspeak. You have to devise a kind of language in order to support certain thoughts. So if you look at this war through the lens of a linguist, do you see any other kinds of news speak when it comes to this crisis?
Unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is description of Putin. It's very interesting to watch the language that's being used in Europe as well. Putin is the ultimate evil, a new Hitler, a madman, maniac, can't know what he's going to do next because he's so crazy. That's one belief. Then there's a second belief. We must tempt him to carry out further destruction of Ukraine. We must carry out an experiment, a grotesque experiment, to see if, by refusing to talk about a political settlement, by not offering any way out, we'll see if he will choose to, this maniac, this Hitlerian madman, we'll see if he'll choose to just slink away quietly in defeat, or whether he'll use the power that, of course, he has to destroy Ukraine. Let's try the experiment. That's Europe. That's the West. That's Western liberal intellectuals. Let's try the experiment to see what this twisted mind, this maniac, will do. What does that tell you about attitudes towards Ukrainians on the part of Western liberal intellectuals? Well, you can figure it out. Incidentally, since you bring up Orwell, let me mention something that I think is a little more relevant today. I'm sure you've read Animal Farm.
Yeah.
On the totalitarian enemy. I don't know what edition you have, but you might open it and see if it has Orwell's introduction. Does it have an introduction by George Orwell?
No, not the one in which he talks about the English media apparatus.
What? Is there an introduction on literary censorship in England?
No, I've read that one, but it's not in here. No, it's not in here.
Well, just take a look when you have time. No, very interesting reason. It was written. George Orwell wrote an introduction to Animal Farm. Wasn't published. Was found many years later in his unpublished papers. It's on literary censorship in England. And the introduction says, look, this is a satire of the totalitarian enemy, but that we're supposed to hate. What about free England? He says, in free England, I'm now quoting, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And he gives some examples. Then he gives a couple of explanations. He says one reason is the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in seeing certain ideas suppressed. And the other reason, which is more interesting, is just the general culture, including the intellectual culture. You've gone to the best universities, Cambridge, Oxford. You have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say. They just can't say them, okay? Like you can't say the phrase unprovoked invasion of Iraq. Just the words just don't come out of your mouth. That's Orwell in his unpublished essay on suppression of speech in free societies. That's the one we ought to read. I should add, it's not one of his great essays, but these few sentences are important.
You say there are things that are not to be talked about or not to be told. Today I read on that the Florida Department of Education banned 20 or 24 or maybe 50, I don't know the exact number, school books because they contain certain topics like critical race theory, like social emotional learning. So there is a big body of there are lots of things we are not supposed to talk about in American education. So what do you think the
That's
party?
quite serious.
Yeah,
I mean, the Republican Party is basically a proto-fascist party. They're pretty open. Their model, the one they love, and is Orban's Hungary. In fact, the American Conservative Union is having its next meeting in Hungary. If you look at the main organs of the Republican Party, Fox News and so on, they just lavish praise on Orban. He's doing what they want. He's establishing a white Christian nationalist autocracy. That's their goal, quite explicit. And this requires suppressing speech. And they're way in the lead in doing it. Their goal is exquisite. We have to prevent children from having anything that's divisive or that may make them feel uncomfortable. In other words, all of history's divisive. If you have any brains, it makes you feel uncomfortable. Okay, but we have to prevent that, because now comes the words they're not saying. The words they're not saying but are clear are, we have to establish a white supremacist Christian nationalist country in which the wrong people aren't even allowed to vote, so we can have a permanent lock on power to establish something like Orban's Hungary or maybe beyond. Perfectly open. Governor Ron DeSantis, the second most significant figure in the party, first is Trump, a likely presidential candidate. He has just banned 40% of mathematics books for children because they might contain a phrase that says something like, we should try to work with each other in sympathy. That's divisive. Okay, 40% of math texts. And Republican legislators all over the country are forcing libraries to eliminate books, organizing people to fire librarians, to make sure that nothing but patriotic slogans are ever heard by children. That's quite open. This is well beyond manufacturing consent. Manufacturing consent is about subtle means of control, the kind Orwell was talking about. This is overt proto-fascism. I wouldn't call it fascism because that gives it too much credit. Fascism had an ideology, Gleichschaltung. The powerful state runs everything. They don't want that. They want business to run everything. They are in service to extreme wealth and corporate power. So they're not true fascists in the Hitler style with real ideology, just all the symptoms of fascism, like suppressing independent thought, ensuring Christian nationalist white supremacy and so on. Plenty of this, and a lot of violence. The United States has militias all over the place, white nationalist militias. They outgun the police. They're serious. We saw it on January 6th, small piece of it. Whatever you say about January 6th, it was an attempted coup, which came pretty close. They came pretty close to kidnapping the vice president and probably compelling him to invalidate the election. That's a coup. It was no joke, and the militias weren't even participating. They were in the background, and they were threatening to kidnap governors of states surrounding the Capitol and so on. And that's what's in line for the United States. They'll take power in November, notice, and maybe be able to move on by suppressing vote to get back into gain all three organs of government. They already have the Supreme Court, gain them all by 2024. Then move on to establishing an Orban-style illiberal democracy in the United States and driving the world towards disaster. Because remember, they are 100% climate denialist. 100%. The leader, Trump, goes beyond. He wants to, and in fact, in office, he did accelerate the use of the most destructive fossil fuels and eliminate all measures that might mitigate their effects. That's a death sentence for the species. That's what we're facing. And it's not in Andorra. It's in the richest, most powerful country in world history. No one is going to escape.
Yeah, you referred to the environmental crisis in other interviews. Since we are trying to eliminate our Russian gas supplies, we are fossil fuels are back in business. I mean, you said there is a threat of nuclear war, but there's a war that goes beyond the existence of humankind. So, could you elaborate a bit about the other crisis? We have war, we have nuclear war, but in the background, there's a different crisis going on.
Didn't quite catch it. Could you say it again?
You talk about a natural disaster if we go back to fossil fuel again. And we look at Russia right now, but we forget, or we don't forget, but there is another environmental crisis going on right now. What are your thoughts on that? The other crisis, the environmental crisis right now.
The environmental crisis?
Yeah, you talked about Trump, who was going back to fossil fuels, and
take yesterday's news from Pakistan, and take a look at the weather report in Pakistan yesterday. Temperatures went up to 50 degrees Celsius. This is a poor country where people don't have air conditioners. Try to put yourself in a room at 50 degrees Celsius with no air conditioner. Okay, and it's increasing. In fact, on the course we are now pursuing, South Asia will be unlivable. The Middle East will be unlivable. Large parts of Africa will be unlivable. You don't just have to look at weather reports. You can look at the report of the IPCC, Community of Science, a consensus report, so it's conservative, always has been. It's always underplayed the dangers. The latest one, a couple of weeks ago, I think it was April 4th, it was the most dire warning ever. They didn't mince any words. It said straight out, we have a very narrow window of opportunity to try to save the planet. It's closing. We must immediately start reducing fossil fuels and end them entirely within a couple of decades if we hope to have a livable world. Well, actually, there were some small steps towards this, nowhere near enough, some at least. One of the major crimes of Putin's invasion of Ukraine is to reverse the process. By now, forget it. Have to produce fossil fuels as fast as we can. The ExxonMobil just announced with glee a new major oil find, enormous field off the coast of Guyana, may match the Gulf of Mexico. A wonderful way to drive the world to destruction even faster. And now they're very happy about it because instead of being criticized, the major oil companies are being praised for saving civilization. by destroying the world as quickly as we can. The joy in the offices of the energy corporations is immeasurable, almost as much as the joy in the offices of the great weapons producers, who are gloating huge weapons expenses to drive the world to disaster. Meanwhile, the fossil fuel companies are being praised to the skies. No environmentalists bothering them. Praised to the skies for racing to destroy civilization, organized life on Earth. I mean, if some alien exists and is watching what's happening on Earth, how can they? We're just a bunch of maniacs, total maniacs.
We have been talking about a lot of well, um, dreadful topics, negative thing. If you look at the world right now, it's you almost start to think it's a total mess, just like the alien would look from outer space to planet Earth. Are there any well, do in the end, do you have a positive outlook on the world, or is it mainly negative? Do you have hope for a better planet, for a better future?
I mean, yesterday, for example, I gave a talk, a virtual talk in England to a marvelous group of young people, Extinction Rebellion, who are going all out to carry out any activities they can think of to break the silence, to break the passivity, to bring people to understand what's happening and to act decisively to overcome it, to make use of the window of opportunity that we do have. We have the means to overcome the crisis. They're known. You can read them in reports of the International Energy Organization, which comes out of the energy corporations. Detailed, sensible, feasible plans about how to get rid of fossil fuels and how to move to sustainable energy with a small percentage of gross domestic product. There are studies by leading economists like my colleague Robert Pollin, Jeff Sachs, and others, with plans pretty much the same. There's a resolution on the floor of Congress, US Congress, advanced by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, young representative who came in on the Sanders wave, and Ed Markey, senior senator from Massachusetts, who's been involved in environmental issues for years. The resolution lays out a detailed program by which the United States can solve the energy crisis, create a much better world at 2 to 3% of GDP, far less than was spent to bail out the super rich financial institutions from the limited cost they suffered from COVID. Fraction of that, okay? Can be done. It's all there. We know how to do it. Well, there are people like Extinction Rebellion or similar movements in the United States. Yesterday, there were demonstrations all over the United States, almost all young people doing the same kind of thing, trying to wake people up so we'll do something about what we can do. Or take the miners, coal miners in West Virginia, the main coal mining state. The United Mine Workers Union just agreed to a transition program which would fund miners, as we should, while they move away from coal mining to capping, closing the mines, and moving to sustainable energy. Mine workers accepted this. It's blocked by their representative in Congress, Joe Manchin, a coal magnate, owns coal mines, the leading recipient of fossil fuel funding in Congress. He blocks it, says, no, we can't do this, along with 100% of Republicans. Republicans are 100% denialist party. Either climate change isn't happening, or if it is, we don't care. 100%. And they're coming back into power. The party's owned by Donald Trump, who's the leading denialist in the world. That's what we're facing, okay? But there are signs of hope. Young people, scientists, a couple hundred scientists were arrested recently for chaining themselves to building civil disobedience to climate scientists to try to awaken people from their slumber, their torpor, get them to see what we're doing, overcome the manufacturing of consent. I mean, and it's real. The Republican Party and its echo chamber, media echo chambers like Fox News, just tell people it's not serious. It's a liberal plot started by China, and that's what people hear all the time. A lot of them believe it. You look at polls, about 20% of Republicans think it's an urgent problem. It's only the most serious problem that has ever arisen in human history. Well, that's manufacture of consent. We can make fun of the fact that in Russia, a large majority apparently believe the garbage that comes out of the propaganda system. How funny. Take a look at free societies, okay? No totalitarian control. Just what Orwell said, inculcate into you self the understanding there are certain things it wouldn't do to say. No risk in saying them, but better not to do it. Better to march in parades.
Is there a role for education in this narrative, in this story? Is it part of the solution, education, or is education part of the problem?
It's both. If carried out properly, it's part of the solution. If carried out the way Governor DeSantis wants to carry it out, it inculcates the problem. Children, the Republicans demand that children be protected from divisive topics like history. None of that stuff. Only patriotic slogans. Orban's Hungary, or worse. Well, that's the party that's going to take control in the United States. We're facing a very dangerous situation in Europe as well. No joke. Like, take the French election. I'm pleased that Le Pen didn't win, but not pleased by the fact that France is drifting far to the right. I'm old enough to remember another time when that happened. Vichy France was very popular. There was a resistance. It was marginal, very marginal, brave people, but marginal. Incidentally, here's another example of manufacture of consent. When we think about resistance to the Nazis, what comes to mind is the French resistance, the Maquis. They existed. There were brave people like Claude Bourdet and others, but they were blowing up some railroads. But the real resistance to the Nazis was in Italy and Greece and Yugoslavia. In Italy, the partisans were holding down half a dozen Nazi divisions. They liberated northern Italy before the Allied forces came. In fact, the first task of the Allied forces was to disperse the resistance and to restore the fascist order. That's divisive history. Better not read that. Okay. But the real resistance to the Nazis was Italy, Yugoslavia, and Greece. France was mostly collaborationist, like the Netherlands.
I have two more questions, Professor Chomsky. One is the propaganda model you describe in here consists of 5 filters. The first one is ownership, size, and profit orientation of the mass media. The second one is the advertising license to do business. The third one is sourcing mass media news, and the fourth is flag and the enforcers, and the last one is anti-communism. My question is this still accurate? If you had to rewrite the book nowadays with social media influence of social media, would we come to the same model? That's my first question. My last question is, um, if we want to be if we are aware of this model and we want to be well informed, how do you get your information, Professor Chomsky? What are your sources, and how do you make sure these sources are reliable? When are we talking about real news, and do we talk about fake news? So those are the two questions. How do you get your news? How do you make sure it's reliable? And the first question was, is this still accurate?
Well, on the first question, Ed Herman and I did do a revision in which we concluded, we wrote an introduction saying that the fifth filter was mistaken, was too narrow. It's not just anti-communism, it's anyone you're taught to hate. Okay?
A common enemy.
Could be terrorists, could be pre-Ukraine, could be Russia, anything. So the fifth filter had to be changed. But other than that, we didn't see any real reason to change it. Even with the rise of social media, the news still comes from the same place. Social media Facebook doesn't have a bureau in Ukraine, you know. The news comes from the traditional media. One of the worst effects of social media, very dangerous effect, is to have substantially destroyed mainstream journalism extensively. There used to be very good local newspapers in the United States. Mm-hmm. I lived most of my life in Boston. The Boston Globe was a first-rate newspaper. Actually, I used to visit their editorial offices to talk to the editors about issues they should cover. Some of the reporters were close personal friends. In the 1980s, the best reporting on Reagan's sadistic crimes in Central America was coming from the Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, Los Angeles Times, Detroit Free Press, Chicago Tribune, many very good newspapers, Miami Herald. They're almost all gone. They were wiped out by one of the curses of capitalism, the reliance on advertising that financed the newspapers. That was all taken over by Google and other social media.
1 second, I have to. My battery is running out. Just 1 second. There we go. You were talking about Google taking over.
The newspapers were based on advertising.
Yeah.
Capitalist curse. And as the advertising shifted to social media, the local newspapers collapsed. That's a very serious attack on the whole information system. It used to be a newspaper like, say, the Boston Globe, not only had a Washington office and foreign offices and outstanding journalists, totally gone. Now it just uses wire services and local reporting, and that's happened all over the country. That's a very serious problem. Well, other than that, the social media have a mixed effect. They do provide the opportunity to read national media elsewhere. You can read foreign media. Actually, you can't anymore in the United States because rigid censorship has set in from the government, and you can't read any media that have an origin in Russia. Some of the main U.S. journalists, the most outstanding U.S. journalists, Chris Hedges, formerly bureau chief for the New York Times in the Middle East and the Balkans can't read him anymore because his reporting and commentary come out on RT, and the U.S. population
Russia
has
Today, you mean?
to from anything that might have the taint of Russia. So we're not allowed to know what Russians think, or even what Americans think who happen to have their work appear there. But before that, social media do give the opportunity to read foreign press. Almost nobody makes use of that opportunity. It's there, but it's not used. Social media do allow the possibility of hearing a wide range of opinions. Almost no one uses it. What people do is go into their own little bubble where they hear their own opinions reinforced, becoming more extreme, and so on. So it has possibilities, and they're sometimes used effectively, but it's also dangerous. You ask where I get my news?
Well, of course, you are a public speaker. You write books. People talk to you. You do podcasts like mine. So you better make sure your information is correct. So how do you make sure you get the right information?
My information is spread in Europe and the South, almost never in the United States. Occasionally I'm asked to write an op-ed by a newspaper, but then they cancel it because it's not the kind of thing they want. Can't possibly be on TV, even the liberal channels. They're totally closed. It's not censorship, just a very tight system. But where do I get my news? From the mainstream press. A lot of people who read Manufacturing Consent didn't notice that a large part of it is defense of the press, defense of the courage and responsibility of reporters on the ground who do excellent work, defending them against a vicious attack by Freedom House, who charged that they lost the war because of their reporting on the ground, an attack that was full of outrageous lies and falsifications. We went through it and exposed that. That's about a third of the book. So you want to know what's happening on the ground? Mainstream press. And you want to know about war crimes in Ukraine? Press does a very good job of exposing them. Very fine job of exposing the crimes of others. That it does very well. And you can learn a lot about it. So yes, and the reporters are courageous, honorable. What happens in the editorial office is something quite different often.
Well, I was just wondering, of course, you want to know what's happening in Russia as well. What kind of stories and narratives do the people hear? Do you have any access to, let's say, sites like Russia Today, or do you have sources in Russia that share information with you?
Take yesterday. Turned out Foreign Minister Lavrov made a very important speech laying out carefully Russian aims and the Russian interpretation of the war, what they call the limited military operation. I was able to find that by a diligent search of the Indian press. It was reported in detail in India. And if you work hard, you can find the Indian mainstream press which reported it. So we're not totally shut off. Incidentally, back in the 1970s, there were some US government studies of where Russians got their information using whatever kinds of evidence they were able to accumulate. Their conclusion was most of them got it from BBC. They simply didn't believe the lying Russian press. If the press said something, the opposite's probably true. So they found ways to pick up BBC or Voice of America. Read some as illegal, but they were circulating. And the final conclusion was that in totalitarian Russia, people may have been getting a wider range of information than in the West.
That's hard to believe. But do you think that's still the case nowadays when the mainstream Russian media is almost non existent? Or, I mean, the critical Russian press is totally eliminated?
Well, Russian media today are totally controlled. Of the few, there were a few fairly independent media, but they've been closed down and the editors sent off to prison. By now, it's the 70s, remember, there was a period of some relaxation, but now it's tightened very, very harshly. I don't think Russians hear anything, but we can, like as I said, I could read Foreign Minister Lavrov's speech if you work hard enough and find your way to the Indian press. You can't read Chris Hedges, major American correspondent, because his reports appear on RT. Americans aren't allowed to hear that.
Professor Chomsky, that were more than 45 minutes, so I'm going to finish here. I'd like to thank you for your time, Professor. It was really enlightening, and you were really generous, and it was really nice to speak to you for a second time. So keep up the good work, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good to talk to you.